This conference will now be recorded.
So I am on my Azure DevOps organization. So as we were discussing yesterday, we said what an organization is, and we said what a project inside an organization is. In my case, I have multiple projects out here. Like I have multiple projects. I've been working on multiple projects out there. So we said yesterday the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and fill up the form that I was talking about. So I said, please go ahead and fill up a form, which will kind of help you to go ahead and let's say I said that why you need to fill up the form and etc. We will discuss about that in a later session. But the first request is to go ahead and kind of submit that out. After that, I said you just need to click on new project out here. And once you click on new project, you have this particular option out here. In your case, it will be like private. In my case, I also have a public. So I will say, okay, fine. Since it's a 7 a.m. class, I'll say 7 a.m. class project. And you can give a description like this is a test project or something like that. And say create. And as and when you do that, you will have a project that's getting created for you. So you have an Azure DevOps project. So now you have a couple of things. You have the organization and you have the project inside the organization. So what you can do with the project, what you can do with the organization, let's discuss about that in a very brief way. We can come back to that again. So in the organization level, now this is the organization level. If I'm able to see all the projects, this is the organization level. I have something called as the organization settings. So what I can do with this is that I can click on the organization settings and I can go here and I can look at all the settings that are there in my organization, like the usage that I have, the Active Directory integration, meaning if I have an Azure DevOps Active Directory, if I have an Azure Active Directory, I can go ahead and add the Active Directory in here, the time zone where I am and all that stuff. And most importantly, something called as users, where you can go ahead and add multiple users inside the project. You can add multiple users inside the same project out here, and you can make sure that there is a collaborative effort that is going around, meaning you can have your entire team added in here, and you can also go ahead and add people in the form of groups also. You can assign them multiple permissions. You can tell what kind of a permission each and every user has as such. So the procedure to add a user is pretty simple. You just need to click on add user out here. You just need to say the name of the user. For example, let's say gmail.com. So I do not have an ID. So I can just invite a user, and there are different levels of access out here. And in our case, since this is a basic account, the most frequent subscription that we go ahead and use is a basic level. And then you can add the user directly to the project. For example, I am dealing with a project called 7am project. I can add the user to one or multiple projects in my organization, and I can assign what kind of a role can a user really take up inside an organization. For example, you have like three different roles out here when you click on this drop down, which is project contributors, a project reader role, and you have one more role called project administrator. So there are three different roles out here that you can actually assign a user, or you can basically give a user to. And these are three roles that are broadly categorized in this way. So if you click here, a reader can only have read access. Like you have three different RBAC roles in the Azure portal as well, right? A reader, owner, and the contributor. Here, the contributor will have all the roles apart from going ahead and adding users onto Azure DevOps organization. And there is something called project administrator role, which is like the owner of an organization who can go ahead, delete users, delete multiple projects, add multiple projects, and do a lot of things out here. So this helps in promoting a collaborative team effort out here. But let's come back to our diagram that we were talking yesterday. So this is where we are, and this is what we said, that as a DevOps engineer, we need to help teams in getting into the thought process of a DevOps practice. I'm now talking about something called as a DevOps practice out here. What exactly, what exactly am I really talking about out here is that I am asking the developers to write the code on their local machine, which is okay. So I have multiple developers out here who are now a part of the Azure DevOps organization. I went ahead and added them as a part of the Azure DevOps organization. They're happy, they're able to work with Azure DevOps, and they're writing code from their local machine. I'm good with this because you need some kind of an infrastructure or some kind of an architecture to go ahead and write a code, which I'm okay with. But I am asking the developers not to store the code in their local machine, not to make sure to store their code in their local machine, but I'm asking the developers to store the code into something called as a repository that is there on the cloud. Talking about something called as a repository. What exactly is repository is nothing but it's a space on the cloud. Like you have like unlimited space on the cloud out there where you can push your code or where you can store your code. Now, why do you want to store your code out here? Why shouldn't I, or why is it not the best practice to go ahead and store the code in my local laptop? A couple of reasons. A being this code or this laptop can get corrupt. The data inside your laptop can get corrupt. So all your work will be lost. Work will be lost. Second thing, if the developer or if the person who's working on the code leaves the organization, and where should I, kind of get that code from? Why? I mean, should I again start rebuilding my entire code and etc. Thirdly, when you're working in a team, you're not working independently. You're not working in isolation. You are working in collaboration with a lot of teams again. So this is a collaborative effort. So I need to see your work, you need to see my work. It's vice versa. I need to work on what you're working. You also need to work on what I'm working. So that's a collaborative effort that we need to have. So it's better to have all the code always in a safe, a secure, and a central location. And in our case, a central location out here is something that I'm calling as the repository. And I am now dealing with a repository called Azure Repos. And where do I find that exactly? If you go into the project that you have created, there is something known as a repository or repos in the left hand side of your screen, inside which you have things called files, commits, pushes, branches, tags, and pull requests. There are multiple options out here as and when I just hover around it. So what I'll do is I'll just click on files, and as and when I do this, it just gives me this particular message telling that you know what you the 7 a.m. class project is actually empty. You do not have anything. Do you want to initialize something called as a branch? What are branches? Let's understand this a bit technically. So what I'll do here is that in the very top of my screen, I have something called 7 a.m. class project with a red indicator here which is just a symbol of a repository. So that means that I can have multiple repositories in the same project. You can have multiple repositories for different teams. Let's say you have a development, you have a QA, you have a DevOps team, and etc. They would like to save their files, and they want to save their files in individual repositories as such. So you can have multiple repositories, one for a team. And how do you create a repository? Is when I click here, I have an option to look at which repository that I want to go in. Secondly, I have an option to create a new repository, import and manage repositories. I'll say create a new repository, and I'll say the name of the repository is first repository, and I'll say create. This is how you go ahead and create a repository. So I went here and I said create a new repository, just entered a name, and I had myself a repository created. Then how do you delete one? You can just go into manage repositories. And in my case, in this project, I have two repositories, one which came by default with this particular project called 7am class project. The other is a first repository that I created. So let's say I don't need the 7am repository. I don't really need to, I don't want to really deal with the 7am repository. It's like unnecessary. I do not want this out. I can go here. You have three dots called more options. Say delete. Just enter the name of the repository out here. Say delete. So you can go ahead and delete your repositories as well in this way. So once deleted, your repository is gone forever. So you can go ahead and also delete the repository, and I am only able to delete it because I am the project administrator in this organization. So that's the very reason that I was able to go ahead and delete these repositories and all that stuff. Any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here? Okay, so this is, yes, does someone have a question?
So once tell me repository.
Repository, I mean, did you miss the part where I said repository? Or
Yeah, first of all
is there a
starting.
specific question that you have on repositories?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, is there a specific question that you have on repository?
How to start the repository.
So the repository, I do not start. I created a repository. So here is where you go to files and you click on repository and say new repository, and you just give the name of the repository out here and then say create. Is that what you were expecting, or is that what your question was? Does that answer your question? Okay, fine. Let's come back to that. So this is how I'm creating a repository, and I've just created something called as the first repository out here. So I went ahead and created something known as the first repository, and I'm good now. So what I'll do right now is that now let's go ahead and dig into the repositories and just understand what exactly that you get in a repository. So I said this is how, let's say, the organization structure really is. So you have a top level entity called an organization, which is an Azure DevOps organization out here. So I'll say it is org organization. That's the first one that we created yesterday. And inside the organization, I said we can go ahead and create multiple projects. Like the way I had, you can go ahead and create multiple projects for different clients if you do have. And I have a project specifically called 7am project. And inside this, I am now telling that if you want to store your files inside a project, you have to create something called as a repository. So let me get the diagram of a repository out here. you have to get, or you have to have something called as a repository out here. So I went ahead and created a repository, and you can have multiple repositories inside the same project. Not one, not two, but multiple things inside the same project out here. There is no restriction in how many repositories that you can have. And we've seen how can you create a repository, how can you delete a repository, how can you manage a repository, and etc. And a repository is essential to go ahead and create or go ahead and store your files inside it. Then how do I store my files inside a repository? Let's imagine that repository is like a drive on your computer, inside which, inside a drive, if you want to store the files, let's say that you want folders inside it, right? Different folders, because your computer is being used by your entire family, so you're dividing your computer into different folders and allocating the different folders to different people in your house. In the same way, in a repository, we start creating something called as branches. Branches are like folders inside a repository, or partitions inside a repository. And a repository by default comes up with something called as a main or a master branch. So this is the hierarchy that we have. Organization is the parent level entity. Inside an organization, you can have multiple projects. Inside a project, you can have multiple repositories. Inside a repository, you can have multiple branches. And by default, a repository comes up with something called as a main branch. So this is how the organization structure really looks like. So if I go here, I have a name of a repository called first repository. This is the name that I do have. Secondly, I have a repository, or I have a branch inside the repository, and this is a symbol of a branch called main. This is where I am. So my organization name is something like, let's see, what's my organization name? It's called some my ADO playground or something like that. So this is the name of my organization. And inside my organization, I have a project called 7 a.m. class project. This is what I'm really looking at. This is what I'm really concerned about. If I go into the 7 a.m. class project, I have something called as repositories. And if I go into the repository, I have something called as a branch inside the repository. Then I said that you can have multiple branches. Then how do I create a branch, or how do I create multiple branch out here? Is that in the left hand side of my screen, you have files, commits, pushes, and something known as branches. This is what I'm really interested into. So I'll just go into something called branches. And by default, I have a branch called main branch. I can go ahead and create a new branch. I can say new. I can say test branch. I can say create. Now I can say new. And now it's asking me the name of my branch and the source of my branch. Or it is telling based on, meaning when you want to create a branch, it should always and always have a source branch. These are called as upstream sources. Meaning, what is the parent branch from which I want, or you want me to create you? So let me see. I have two branches right now with me. One is the main, one is a test. I can also create another branch called test branch 1 based out of the test branch out here. So test branch 1, and so on and so forth. So in order to create a branch, you at least need to have something called as a main branch in your repository. You need to have at least one branch out here, and this branch comes by default. And if I go inside this branch, I have a file called readme.md file. This is a file which by default came with my repository or by default came with my branch, and it's just giving some bare basic introduction to my project, telling that this is your project, this is how you can build it and all. So it's just giving me a bare basic introduction of my project, and this came by default with your branch. It's like when you purchase a product, you get the user manual along with it, right? This is like the user manual of your repository and how do you use it and all that stuff. Then this is good until now, great until now, and this is how the file actually is looking like. Good till now. But as a developer, how should I interact with my repository? Like, what should I do in order to store my files in my repository? So, working with repository is not a straightforward mechanism. It's not really a straightforward, kind of a story. Working with a repository needs the knowledge of a repository, meaning in my case, I am working with a repository called a Git repository. This is what it's telling me right now is that enter the name of your Git repository, meaning Git is the underlying technology on which my repository is actually based out of. And there are a few commands in Git. I say Git, there is something called Git out here, which is called Git source control manager and etc., which is the repository, or which is, let's say, one of the technology or one of the technologies that is available in the market, which helps you to interact with the repository. What do I mean by interaction with the repository? Let's understand that. Now, the first thing you all need to do is go to this particular website called gitscm.com. Just type in Git or just type in Git for Windows download. Just do a simple download out here. And based upon the system that you have, whether it's a 32-bit Windows or a 64-bit Windows, you can just download the setup file for this particular or for your computer. So in my case, it was a 64-bit operating system. I just said download the 64-bit git setup out here, and as and when you click that, you will have a file downloaded, which is like about 50 MB file. It's a very simple installation. It's a very straightforward installation out there, wherein you just need to click next, 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 and install this out. This will install something called as Git in your laptop, in your local machine. So the first thing what I'm doing is installing Git out here, and after I install it, just type in Git out here. You'll see all these things that are coming up called Git Bash, Git UI, Git CMD, and everything. The second thing what I need to do is that in order to interact with my repository, this is my first repository out here, and in order to interact with this repository, I need to make a local copy of my repository. Meaning I need to just make a replica of my repository in my local machine. So I need to download all this repository to my local machine. So the first thing or the first step is to go ahead and download something called as Git for Windows. This is the first step that I'm actually working on. After that, I'm saying if you want to interact with your repository, why do you want to interact with your repository? There are a lot of files in your system that you want to make sure to store in the Git repository or in the Azure repos. So in order to start interacting with it, in order to start dealing with it, I'm first telling that you have a repository, great, but you need to first make a local copy of the repository in your machine. So I have my laptop. I need to make a copy of the repository in my local machine. Or in a very simple layman term, you need to download this entire repository to your local machine to start interacting with it. This process of making a copy of the repository, now this is called a repository on the cloud or a remote repository. This process of making a replica or making a copy of the repository on the cloud to your local machine is called a git clone operation. This process is called a git clone. So how do you clone your repository? And please focus on these terminologies, guys. These are very, very important interview questions. So this process now is called a clone, and since I'm dealing with a Git repository, it's called a Git clone. So I am now doing a clone operation of my remote repository into my local machine. How do I do that? If I go here, there's a button called clone. Once I click on this, it's now asking me, okay, fine, great, you want to clone, fine. I will help you do that. But where do you want to clone it? Like using what do you want to clone it? There are multiple tools using which you can clone this out. Like you have Android Studio, you have a lot of you have something called Eclipse and etc. In my case, since we have been using Visual Studio in order to write our ARM templates and everything, I'll say Visual Studio. And as and when it's like saying Visual Studio out here, let me do a cancel. So you have multiple options out here called Visual Studio, a lot of things out here. So Visual Studio is the full version, which is called Visual Studio 2019. And you also have the VS Code. So this is what I intended to click. So Visual Studio and VS Code, anything is okay. But since this is a lighter version to kind of deal with, I'll click on VS Code. I'll say open Visual Studio Code. So I'm saying a clone. I did this. I'm saying a clone, and I'm saying clone in VS Code. And as and when I do that, it'll open my VS Code in my local machine, and it'll just ask me are you sure you want to clone it? Where do you want to clone it? Now it's telling allow the extension to open this URL. Yes, please open this URL. As and when I do it, it's now asking me, can you please select a folder in your local machine where I can make a copy of the repository? So I'll just go into, let's say, a drive of my a drive of my system, and I'll say select this one. I'm good with this. And now it's starting to do something called as a git clone. And this is only possible because I have the Git installed on my local machine. You have to first install Git, and only then you can start working with this. Now, as and when I do this, it's now telling me, would you like to open the clone repository or add your current workspace? I'll say open. I'm good with that. I'll say don't save. And I have something called as the first repository that is getting reflected in my VS Code. What exactly this means is that Git had successfully downloaded all this repository and made a copy of it in my local system in the form of a folder called first repository out here, inside which I have the readme.md file. So it's just showing whatever the contents that were there on this file here. So whatever that were there in this file, it's just getting reflected in the notepad that I have in my local system. What I'll do here is that now I'll say that, okay, fine, I'm dealing with a repository called first repository, and I am working with this repository on a branch called main branch. If you look at the bottom of my screen, It's just telling that you are working on a branch called as a main branch out here. So my clone operation is successful. Now, please observe carefully on what I'm doing out here is that if I go into this file, I can go ahead and add some lines out here. For example, I can add another line called this is a test line. See if my changes are saved. So I'm just adding a line. As in when I added it, it's now telling me that it's a white dot, meaning it's an unsaved file. So I'll firstly do one thing. I'll just say save. And as in when I save this out, the color of the file changed it. The color, it's now turning into orange. And here I have a green line. And in here, if you observe this button here, it has a symbol of a branch and it has one towards it. So what exactly this is? Let me go here. Now it's telling this is the change. This is what you have changed out here. There is one change in something called as the readme.md file. And if I click on this, it will also show me what is the change that I've done. So if I scroll down, earlier I did not have this line, and here I just added this line is what this is now telling me. So what is it doing is that it's keeping a track of the changes. Who's keeping a track of the changes? A software called Git that is installed on my local machine. Software called Git is now able to track the changes to my files. It's telling what is the change that you made, what is the time of the change that you made, and are you okay with this change, and etc. And a lot of stuff like that. So I'll say, great, this is the change that I made, which is good enough. Now, in order to save this change, talking about saving this change, the change is not saved yet. In order to save this change, I need to make sure to do an operation called git commit. Commit is nothing but saving the changes so that git can keep a track of it. I'd like to make sure to save these changes. How do I do that? Is here you have something called as changes, and here you have something called as a plus button out here which says stage all changes. What do you mean by stage is nothing but before committing, Git will now ask you that okay fine, if you have 100 files out here, do you want to stage all that 100 files, meaning do you want to prepare those changes to get committed? This is a step that comes before commitment, which is called staging, and technically this is called a git stage. How do I stage it? Is just go here and just click stage all changes, and now it says stage changes and changes, and under changes I do not have anything. There is nothing, there is no file, there's 0 files out here, and there is one file in the staging area. This is called a staging area, meaning this file is now prepared to get committed. So this file is now prepared for the commit process, and now it says please enter a commit message, and I'll say this is my first change. As in when I do this, I have this button called commit, and I'll say commit. Commit is done. Now you do not have any changes. Now if you see this, the branch symbol in your local machine doesn't show that it has any changes. It's like good enough with this. Now one question that I want to ask you all is that change is saved. It says this is a test line to see if my changes are saved. And if I go into my local machine and just click this out, it says this is a test line to see my changes are saved. This is saved. This is good enough. So I want to ask you all one question is that if I go into the file here and I haven't refreshed my screen yet, so if I refresh it, do you think that the line will come up? This line which is called, where's that? This line which is called, this is the test line, my changes are saved or not. This line, do you think it'll get reflected here? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, it will get reflected.
Okay, so let's try
It
doing
will
that.
reflect.
Let's mhm, let's refresh the screen, and the line number 21 is not coming at all. So I'll just try refreshing this once again, and I'll try refreshing this multiple times. Nope, it's not coming at all. The reason being, the commit that you did is that you committed all these changes to your local machine's memory. The commit was done to the Git memory of your local machine. So Git has a memory to keep a track of all these changes, and you have committed these changes to the Git memory that is there in your local machine. What do I mean by the Git memory in the local machine? Is that if I go into the folder, if you look at my repository, I only have one file here called main.md. But when I clone this repository, I also get another file called .git. Now you'll only be able to see this provided you have this option enabled. So if I go into my folder view, I have something called view hidden items. So this will come like a hidden item, and this has a lot of things like references, objects, and etc. Meaning this is called the Git local database, wherein all the changes that you are doing to the files inside this particular folder, in my case only readme.md file, all the changes are being tracked locally. All the changes are now being tracked on your local machine. Meaning, what does this really mean is that if I want to work with Git in my local machine, meaning till now I did a work with Git in my local machine. If I want to work with it in the local machine, if I want to let Git track all my changes, I don't need to stay connected with the internet. I don't need internet. Internet is not required, meaning I can work offline and I can still allow Git to track my changes without having a connection to the internet and without having a connection to this particular repository that is on the cloud. I don't have to do that. It's not a mandate. This type of repositories is called distributed, just a second, distributed source control manager. or distributed version control mechanisms, or in short, distributed repositories. Meaning you don't need to have an internet connection. You can work offline. You don't need to stay connected with the central repository. You can start working offline, and you can make your changes, and you can later have your changes getting reflected out here. And very popular examples of distributed repositories are Git. You have something called Bitbucket, and there are a lot of things that are on the offer. Even Azure repos that we are dealing with right now is nothing but a brainchild of Git. Now, Git wasn't firstly an open source company. Later, Microsoft purchased this Git, and they are now calling this as Azure repos. Meaning, just another term for Git out here is an Azure repos. So, if someone is asking you whether you worked on Git, and you say no, I'm worked on Azure repos, it's one and the same. Git is nothing but Azure repos out here, and you have another repository called Bitbucket out here. There are the second type of repositories which are not that popular these days. It is called a centralized source control manager, which would need internet to really work on this. Without internet, I won't be able to keep a track of my changes. You will definitely need to get connected or be always connected with the central server, which is the remote repository. And the examples for that is something called TFVC, Team Foundation Version Control. There is something called Nevercode. Nevercode is a build one. What was that? Sorry, SVN. It's called Subversion. So these are the popular examples of something called as a centralized source control manager. Then how do I get to decide whether I'm on, if I created a project, how do I get to decide whether I am on a Git, or I am on a distributed, or I am on a centralized? Is that when you created a project, there is something called project name, description, public, private, something called advanced, and it's now asking what is the source control that you actually need. And when you click this button, it'll tell you what are the types of source controls. It says Git, it says TFVC, which is centralized, and it'll give you a list of, let's say, uh, differences between what is TFVC, what is Git, and etc. So I'll just give this documentation to you all. I'll just tell you why Git is good, what is Git versus TFVC, and etc. And in here is where you can now decide whether you want to go for Git or whether you want to go for something called Team Foundation Version Control. This is what Azure DevOps as of now supports: a distributed type and a centralized type. And you have the entire uh, you have, let's say, the entire documentation for it, like what is exactly this, and what is, let's say, the difference between all these things, and etc. So it's a great documentation. I would suggest to give it a read. Yes, guys, any questions? Does anyone have any questions?
So if we use Git or TFVC, there's no much difference between both the versions, right? Or
There
will
is actually a lot of difference. Reason being, TFVC doesn't allow you to work in a collaborative way, meaning you will always have to be connected to the central server in order to make your changes. But in my case, I can still make my change. I can keep a copy of the change on my local machine, and I can keep track of my changes. Very importantly, keeping track is very important. This is what I'm really interested in.
so if we use TFVC, we will not be able to keep the track of the changes what we are making, right? In the local
Uh,
machine.
in the local machine, until you are connected to the internet. Until
Okay.
and unless you are connected to the internet, that's when you will be able to keep a track of the change, meaning you cannot work in an offline mode.
Okay. I had another question. Like you have added only one line here.
Right.
What if we are doing multiple changes? See, you have added one line here, so you have saved it, and again
Hmm.
later sometime you have again changed this README file. So
Okay.
can we have the changes for the multiple a track of the multiple changes?
Sure, I mean, you can do that. For example, let's say this is a second line. I can also say this is a third line.
So this is the second time which you're saving this file.
Hmm. That's right. And as in when I do that, if you look at this, I again have changes here. So even if you add a single dot, even that is tracked. So this was the previous commit. This commit is now in
Yes.
memory. Now I have two more lines out here. I can again stage these changes. I can say stage, and I can say this is a second commit, and I can say commit this out.
Okay. So will I be able to see the first file, the original file here? Now how you're comparing these two files?
The reason I'm able to compare these two files is because I have the comparison tree out here, because this will only come into place when you actually start working on this, when you actually have a change out here. So you can only compare it when you have a change out here. So in my case, I said, okay, fine, I have a change. So I said, since I did a change, I was able to compare between what is the previous state of the file versus what will be the state of the file. So you need to do a change in order to make the comparison tree work.
Okay.
Sir, physically the files are exist, right? Version files. What are the first change and second change?
Physically, they won't. Physically, they are not. It's just a virtual file out here, meaning physically they won't. It's just the file, but it's keeping a track of it. It's keeping a track on what are the changes in your local machine till now. So it's just telling what are the changes that you have still done here.
But if we do not have a
Mhm, mhm.
physical file existing here, how will we get to know what changes have we done? So maybe a 1 month later or 2 months later, if we have to go back and check this file,
Mhm.
what was the original file and what is that it is existing now? How will we get to know that?
So that's the reason I will not keep all these files out here. Like I will not keep all these changes out here. Rather, I'll sync my changes with the cloud. That's what it is right now telling. Is that once I do the sync out here, let me go here, and once the sync is done, I'll show you how exactly it looks like. So wait for a couple of minutes and done. The sync is done. It says the sync is done. It's into the main branch. And now if I look into the main branch out here, if I look into the empty file, I'm now able to see all these lines, and I'm now able to track the history of all the changes. And if I, let's say, go at a date and want to see what is the change that I've done, this is how the change is. So this was the very first line that I added. Later, I had another change, which is my second commit. This is the second and third line that I added. So this is how I will now come to know what was the history, and I can also revert my change. All this history is now tracked in the form of something known as commits out here. So this was the first commit. This is the first thing that I added, the very first thing. And then I had a first commit, then I had a second commit, and so on and so forth. So I can have a full copy of, I mean, I can have basically browse the file and I can do a lot of things out here. So this is how I will now start tracking things out. Got this?
Okay. Yes, yes, I got it. One more question. When we are
Mhm,
working with the main file or the default file which we have got it here,
mhm,
why is it
mhm,
we are creating the other repos also? As you've created first test first repo and the second one,
mhm, mhm.
but still we are working with the main file there.
Oh, you mean the branch, right? Yeah, we're working still with the main branch.
Branch.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So if you'd like to work with a different branch apart from the main branch, right? You need to change the branch here. Now I'm working with something called main. You can say it's not main, but it is, let's say, something like test branch one. And if you see this right, the file now doesn't have all these things out. In the test branch one, the file doesn't have these things out. The reason being, I did not do this change in something called test branch one. I only have done this change on the main file. So this is now a
Yes,
different copy of the file that's coming into picture.
correct. But my question is now,
Hmm.
as you're working on a main branch,
Hmm.
why do we have to create another branch? Was my question, or is it really
So
necessary to create another branches?
certainly yes, but why do you need branches is something that we will cover in a topic called branching and merging strategies. That why do you need so many branches out there? Like, why do you have so many branches out there? Why do you don't have only one branch? What is the fuss behind it and etc. So I did not go into that topic yet. So once we come into that topic, we can cover that particular aspect of what's the need for so many branches if you have just one branch, and what is the logic behind companies having so many branches out there. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yes, yes, sure. Thank you.
Hmm? Anything else, guys? And when I did an operation called sync, so there was something called sync out there. When you did a change here, for example, let's say I do a change here. This is a test change. I save here. As and when I save, the changes will get reflected. So I'll stage my changes. I will enter a commit message called this is a commit on test branch. And as and when I do it, it's now telling me to sync my changes. This operation of uploading the change into the repository from my local machine. Now, this is the direction what I did for a git clone. This is the direction, meaning I am now making sure to upload all my changes from my local machine. This is called as a push operation, and this is called a git push. As and when I say sync, it's telling the action will push and pull commits from all this. I'm like good with this. I'll say okay. So I am pushing all my changes into the remote repository and into a particular or a specific branch of my remote repository called as a test branch one. As and when you do this, you'll now see this is the test change and stuff like that. So this is how you start dealing with repositories. This is how you start working with repositories. Like this is the logic behind having a repository out here and how do you track your change and etc. And I can now also have, let's say, a huge track of or let's say the history of all the changes that I have done out here. Any questions, guys? Any questions with this? Anyone?
Hi
Anything with
Kiran.
this? Yeah. Hi, Naveen. Please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, does Git push needs an internet connectivity or we can push those changes in offline mode as well?
You cannot do that because if you want to push to, let's say, or if you're, when you're doing a push operation, you're trying to communicate with the remote repository that is there somewhere, like that's hosted somewhere, right? So for that, you
Yeah.
need this connection to go over the internet. So you need a communication mode to do that.
Okay. Except that local, apart from that local, we need internet connectivity apart from
Correct.
local.
Apart from the local, yes.
Okay. Yes, yes, Kiran.
Anything else, guys? Okay, so
Correct.
hmm? Yep, please go ahead. Okay, so if there are no further questions, then we're good to close, guys, and we will have a holiday tomorrow, and we will meet on Monday. So have a great festival, guys, and hope you'll have a safe one. Thank you.
Thank you.